Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our CB seminar again. We could begin with Gasho, please. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. I don't think it's necessary for most of you all know Reverend Dr. David Matsumoto. Today he'll be speaking on Uen no Chishiki, or my Revered Dharma teachers. He's probably one of the only students of these teachers who they would want to consider their students. Many of us had taken classes, but they'd be more embarrassed to have us as their students. So I'm very happy to have Reverend Matsumoto speak about these teachers today. Many of them, well, all of them are no longer with us. So it's a very good insight into who these people were. So thank you, Reverend Matsumoto.
Thank you, Reverend Hirano. I really appreciate your inviting me to be a part of today's SOFA lecture. Thank you to everyone who has registered and is here today. I really am very grateful that we get a chance to see each other again. The world is beginning to open up, but very slowly. And hopefully it'll just be a matter of months perhaps when we can actually have in-person sessions again and actually begin to share the Dharma face-to-face. But this is still a good solution. We get to meet together with all of our good friends in Hawaii and Brazil and East Coast and West Coast and all around the world. So in that sense, it's a great opportunity to be together with all of you, at least virtually today. I'd like to begin my talk, first of all, by sharing my screen. Let's see. Okay. So the title of my talk is My Revered Teachers. And I just wanted to say that I'm very honored to be able to speak today about these three individuals, Reverend Haruyoshi Kusada, Reverend Takamaru Shigaragi, and Reverend Jitsuen Kakehashi. All three of these teachers have been tremendous influences on a number of people, really, and just have made such an impact, not only in Shin Buddhist teaching, but in the hearts and the minds of so many Nembutsu followers, really throughout the world. I'm very honored now to be able to sort of, maybe not represent, but to speak on behalf of the many students of these teachers. As Reverend Hirano mentioned, all three have passed on to the Pure Land. And so they're not with us anymore physically, but they're, in the case of two of them, their writings are still in existence. And in the case of all of them, their impact remains. However, we have new generations now. I'm extremely old. Reverend Hirano, Reverend Harada are only a little bit old. And so a lot of our teachers that we respected, revered, and learned from, they're gone. And not many people know about them. And so I think this is also another opportunity that we have to introduce these people, not only their teachings, but their personalities, their lives, their thoughts, and their impact to a new generation of people. So anyway, those are all my thoughts as we begin today's SOFA lecture, My Revered Teachers.
What I'd like to do is, as we talk about them today, also to have a sense of how really rare it is to be able to meet a true teacher of the way, a true Dharma teacher. And when we have that opportunity, when we are so fortunate as to be able to learn from a true teacher, it's really life-changing. We realize that this is something that's extremely rare, extremely difficult. As we say in the Three Treasures, hard is it to be born into human life, now we're living it. Difficult is to hear the teachings of the Buddha, now we hear it. And so I think with that sense in mind, we also want to express our gratitude for the opportunity to be able to learn from true teachers of the way. So I'd like to begin by reading the words of Shinran Shonin. May I ask everyone to join me in Gassho? The words of Shinran Shonin from the hymns of the Pure Land. It is difficult to meet true teachers and difficult for them to instruct. It is difficult to hear the teaching well and more difficult still to accept it. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. When Shinran Shonin wrote these words in the hymns of the Pure Land, he was really quoting the larger sutra of the Measurable Life, in which Shakyamuni ends the sutra with words essentially stating the same sentiment. It's very difficult to meet a true teacher. It's very rare. You know, it's extremely, it's mind-boggling to think of all of the conditions, all of the events that had to have occurred and not to have occurred in order to really meet and to hear a real teacher and learn from that teacher. And it's also difficult for a true teacher to instruct, and it's difficult for us to hear, and it's difficult for us to accept those teachings. And so with all of that in mind, I think it's important that we allow ourselves the opportunities to express gratitude, to rejoice in the reality when we are able to really learn from true teachers of the way. Shinran Shonin, well, let me just say that a lot of today's talk is prefaced by an article that appeared in the Wheel of Dharma. Thank you, John Kawamoto, and also the BCA Connect, entitled True Teachers of the Way. I won't go over the article again. Yeah, I give it to you as sort of the introduction to today's talk. But I do mention a couple of aspects that are found in one of the really important texts in the Shin Buddhist tradition, Tannisho, or translated in CWS, Collected Works of Shinran, as a record and lament of divergences. And one of there's a lot of facets to this sense that it's rare to meet a true teacher of the way. One of the facets is certainly Shinran Shonin, who is quoted as saying that I, Shinran, do not have even a single disciple. He didn't claim to be a master who had disciples who would learn from him, who would obey him without question or mindlessly. He didn't believe himself to be that kind of teacher. And there's a reason for that. And I think the reason for it can also be found in the following passage from A Record and Lament of Divergences, Tannisho, in which Shinran is quoted as saying, if Amida's primal vow is true, Shakyamuni's teaching cannot be false. If the Buddha's teaching is true, Shandao's commentaries cannot be false. If Shandao's commentaries are true, can Honen's words be lies? If Honen's words are true, then surely what I say cannot be empty. It's a very famous passage, and one that we find quoted in chapter 2 of Tannisho. It's very interesting to think about what this means, because in some ways we can think about it and say, okay, that makes a lot of sense. But then in other ways, it's counterintuitive to the way in which we sometimes think. So for instance, my normal way of thinking would be, wow, I got a chance to learn from Reverend Kusada and Reverend Shigaragi, Reverend Kakehashi. They were great teachers. They were fantastic teachers, very knowledgeable and wise, and they convinced me that what they were teaching was true. And so what they were teaching is about Shinran, that's great. And Shinran, he really respected Honen, so Honen must be true. And if Honen really respected Shandao, then Shandao must be correct. And we kind of go in that direction from our immediate teacher, and we go outward, arriving ultimately at the teaching of Amida Buddha. We say, oh, all these great teachers are saying it must be true, it must be true. But Shinran is going in the opposite direction. He starts with Amida Buddha's primal vow. And he says, if the vow is true, then Shakyamuni Buddha's teaching must be true, and Shandao's must be true, Honen, and what I say cannot be empty. That directionality, I think, is really important for Shinran, and really, I think, essential, key to the notion that he didn't have a single disciple, and that it's very rare to meet and to hear a true teacher of the way. As I say in the article, what I take this to mean is that the truth of the Dharma flows. It flows from the heart of the Buddha of unhindered light and eternal life. It's received by us. It's experienced as truth within the depths of our hearts. It's experienced as awareness, authenticity, and appreciation as it flows from person to person and heart to heart. So the Dharma flows within us. It takes on truth. Our lives and our hearts and our minds come to manifest and embody that truth. And in that way, the truth of the Dharma continues to flow. And that's how we know it's true. That's how we meet true teachers of the way. And in that sense, then, our encounter with a true teacher of the way, a true Dharma teacher, comes about not because of some would-be teacher's assertion, you have to believe in me, someone on a soapbox might say, or even our own designs. I will choose my own teacher. You know, it's our encounter with a true teacher doesn't come about because of those designs. And so Shinran offered a term in Japanese, chigu, to describe his encounter with his true teacher, Honen. Chigu has a dual meaning, as I mentioned. First of all, it indicates that through the working of Amida Buddha's primal vow, I meet my true teacher. It is not through anyone's doing. It occurs almost as if by chance. And yet, even this meeting, which occurs not through my own doing, almost as if by chance, just through various causes and conditions that I encounter in life. And yet, the teacher whom I encounter in this way is a perfect match for me. My teacher meets me, sees me, knows me where I am, just as I am. That's the sense of Chigu. Okay? And that is, I think, a way of giving expression to this sense of the Dharma flowing from the heart of Amida Buddha through the hearts and minds of all beings. So that's the way in which I think Shinran emphasizes that we meet our true and real teacher of the way. And that's where this phrase, also from Tandisho, Uen no Chishiki, I think has meaning. In the very beginning of that text, there's a preface to the text, which is written in Chinese by the ostensible author Yu Yan, which says in Japanese, Sayuai ni uen no chishiki ni yorazumba ikadeka igyo no ichimon ni iru koto wo enya. Dennis Hiroto translates this as, how can a person gain entrance into the single gate of easy practice if he does not depend on a true teacher with whom he fortunately has karmic bonds? And Dennis translates Uen no Chishiki in the way of the true Dharma teachers, and Jishiki or Kalyana Mitra, whom conditions, the past and present relationships bring us to encounter. So the sense of Uen no Chishiki, that our true teacher of the way is one with whom we have karmic bonds, karmic relationships, connections, sometimes that we don't even know about, sometimes that occur and join together, even as if by chance, okay, not through our own doing. Okay. So that's all background then to the discussion that I'd like to offer today as we talk about these three teachers. I refer them as my revered teachers. That's maybe a little self-centered. They're the revered teachers of many, many people. And my hope today is that I won't blab on too long, that there'll be plenty of time left over. And I'd like to invite people to either share their thoughts or memories or stories of these three teachers, or ask questions about them, so we can all find out more about these three esteemed and revered teachers of the way. So I first want to start by talking about Reverend Haruyoshi Kusada. He was born on August 15th, 1921, and passed away on March 5th, 2013. I describe him this way. He was a humble Renaissance man. And there's this phrase that I find myself saying, and I also have heard many of my friends and colleagues say, he is the reason I became a minister. That's a really a powerful statement about this very humble man. And so it's something I want to talk about. And I also think that he's a true person of the Nembutsu. So let's talk about Reverend Kusada. So Reverend Haruyoshi Kusada was born in Hiroshima, Japan, August 15th, 1921. He lived there during World War II. After the destruction wrought by the atomic bomb, he often ventured into the ruined city in order to try to bring relief to its victims. After the war, he went to Kyoto and studied Buddhism at Ryukoku University, earning BA and MA degrees, as well as the academic rank within the Honganji of Hokkyo. Reverend Kusada received Tokudo ordination in 1951, Kyoshi certification in 1957. He also gained expertise in Jodo Shinshu liturgy and was registered as a Honganji Shumuin. Later, the Gomonshu at the time, Kosho Otani Gomonshu, the abbot of Honganji, assigned Reverend Kusada to accompany Reverend Philip Carl Eidman to America. I'll talk about Reverend Eidman in a little while, where they established the Buddhist Fellowship of Sunnyvale in 1965. Reverend Kusada then received Kaikyoshi status and was appointed as the executive director of the Institute of Buddhist Studies in 1968. During the next 15 years, he taught and nurtured many students, dozens of whom eventually became Jodo Shinshu ministers in the BCA, Hawaii, Canada, and South America. In 1983, Reverend Kusada left IBS. He was assigned to be the resident minister at the Berkeley Buddhist Temple, where he served until his retirement in 1991. After that, he remained active as he taught chanting at IBS and assisted the Numata Center for Translation and Buddhist Research in Berkeley. Throughout the years, Reverend Kusada delighted his students and members with displays of his many skills, including, especially in the area of liturgical chanting, tea ceremony, calligraphy, aikido, gagaku, and magic tricks. Reverend Kusada moved back to Kyoto in his later years, taking up residence in the Vihara home, an assisted living facility sponsored by the Honganji. He passed away at the Osoka Clinic, a short distance from the Honganji, on March 5th, 2013. On March 21st, 2013, a service in memory of Reverend Haruyoshi Kusada was held at the Berkeley Buddhist Temple. And at that time, he was conferred with a posthumous honorary title, or Ingo, of Shishin-in. This is Reverend Kusada and some early pictures of the early Institute of Buddhist Studies, which many of you now know as identify as our dormitory, located at 2717 East Street in Berkeley, California. I just want to talk about Reverend Kusada. As I was thinking about Reverend Kusada and how best to talk about him, I realized that the best way would be through stories, not only my stories, but the stories of many of Sensei's students. Let me just start out with Sensei in his youth. Sensei told us that he was there when the atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. Luckily, he wasn't in the city at the time. What he told us is at the time, he was teaching mathematics to a class of children outside of the city. And so they saw the great flash of light over the city, and all the children rushed to the windows. And Sensei said he instantly knew just what happened. And so he knew there was danger, that eventually the shockwave and the blast would reach the school. And so he wanted to get the children away from the windows. So he said, children, come back to your desks. Let's count the seconds that it takes for the boom to reach us. And they got back to their desks and they began to count. 1, 2, 3. They counted until the big boom hit. He said, okay, now let's calculate how far away the epicenter of the blast was from us. And that way he tried to distract the kids to get them away from the windows to keep them calm. But later that evening, he said, he went into the city of Hiroshima, the ruined city, to help survivors and to find the dead and the injured. And he went repeatedly into the city to offer aid. Later on, Reverend Kusada, Haruyoshi Kusada, became a student at Ryukoku University. And I was told this, I think it was by Reverend Eidman, that when Reverend Kusada was in the MA program, his thesis was on the Kegongyo, which is the Huayan Sutra, the Avatamsaka Sutra, sometimes translated as the Garland Sutra. It's a huge sutra. It's gigantic. And it's maybe 30 times or 40 times in length of the larger sutra. It's very complex, very abstract, extremely difficult. And I asked Sensei once about how he studied the Kegongyo, and he said, after a while, your eyes start spinning around in your head and you get kind of dizzy. Anyway, I was told that he did a fantastic job. He graduated with honors at the top of his class. And as mentioned, he also attained the academic rank within the Honganji of Pokyo. But Sensei never saw himself as a scholar. He never held himself up in sort of some kind of academic elite, but rather he always thought of himself as a simple priest. And yet his knowledge of Buddhism, his knowledge of the Buddhist doctrine was very profound. There's a book that some of you may have encountered called Sake and Satori, written by Joseph Campbell, the very famous writer and author of many books, especially regarding myth. And Campbell recounts his journeys to Japan right after the war. And during that time, he went to Kyoto and he met with a person by the name of Reverend Philip Carl Eidman. Reverend Eidman was a former Christian minister who hailed from Minnesota, of all places, but made his way to Japan and was really enamored with Buddhism, especially with Shin Buddhism. And Reverend Eidman was paraplegic, but he was very energetic and really wanted to pursue his studies. He became something of a celebrity within the Honganji and was really received a lot of help and support from the family of the Gomonshu. And one of the things that the Gomonshu's family did is they assigned Reverend Kusada to be his secretary and assistant. So there's a passage in Campbell's book, Sake and Satori, in which he talks about there are many meetings with Reverend Eidman. He referred to Reverend Kusada as Haru, he called him, who was Reverend Eidman's secretary. And one time they were having this discussion about Kegon doctrine, which is, again, very, very difficult to understand, very abstruse. And Reverend Eidman apparently came to a point where he couldn't explain something to Campbell. And so he called over, Haru, come over here and explain. And he then, Reverend Kusada then explained these details of the Kegon Sutra. Campbell says, Haru, Eidman's secretary, summed up the stages of the shift of perspective from the mechanical to the enlightened view as follows. Seeing a thing, one realizes first that no thing exists. That is the negative side. Simultaneously, however, the positive side must be realized, namely, that is ta-ta-ta. That was Reverend Kusada. Simply, clearly, succinctly, he would get to the heart of the Kegon-kyo. But again, he never considered himself to be a scholar. But the Monshu did assign Reverend Kusada to be the assistant to and secretary of Reverend Eidman. And together they embarked back to America, where they established the Buddhist Fellowship of Sunnyvale. And Reverend Kusada served his good friend loyally until Reverend Eidman's death in 1997. In 1968, Reverend Kusada was appointed the executive secretary of the executive director of IBS, as I mentioned before. And it was at that point he began to inspire many, many young people to study at IBS and to pursue the ministry. Some of my colleagues and friends have shared some of their memories. Reverend J. Shinseki, who was a member, who was a student of Reverend Kusada at IBS, said, I have so many great memories of Reverend Kusada. They're very difficult to sort of single any out. He said one in particular, he said, my father met Sensei one time and asked me then, is that your teacher? When I answered yes, my father said, you will be okay. My father's encounter with Reverend Kusada was very brief, but Sensei must have made an impression on my father. That memory of Reverend Shinseki really strikes home for me as well, because I had almost the exact same experience with my parents. After I decided to stop being a lawyer and move out to California and study Buddhism and possibly become a Buddhist priest, my mother remembers saying, over my dead body. That's not going to happen. I think she thought I was going to be wearing bells and things and dance around airports begging for money or something. Anyway, but they made it out to California. They wanted to see what's going on, and they met Reverend Kusada. And for that moment on, they said, okay, we understand what you're doing. Please do what you need to do. So he had that kind of influence, not only on students, but the parents of students. Reverend Jerry Hirano shares this memory. He said, when I first met Reverend Kusada, it was in the summer of 1976 or 77 at an IBS retreat held at the Ogden Buddhist Temple. Reverend Hirano says, meeting Reverend Kusada, Russell Hamada, and Jay Shinseki made me decide I wanted to go to IBS to study with Kusada Sensei. I never wanted to live in California, but I knew I had to study with Reverend Kusada. He taught me so much about the true essence of Jodo Shinshu and life, not just with words. It was his life and the way he lived it. This is the impact that Reverend Kusada had on many, many people. And that's why I said that phrase that I've heard repeated over and over again by my friends and colleagues, he was the reason I became a minister. That's certainly the case with me as well. I first met Reverend Kusada at a summer session. IBS used to have a summer session, a 4-week summer session in 1981. And during that time, the mornings each day was spent with lectures, and we had lectures by these great scholars and academicians. We learned about Mahayana doctrine, Yogacara, Madhyamika thought, all sorts of great things. In the afternoon, we'd go off on field trips to do cultural events. And a lot happened. And then after it was over, I went back to Minnesota, I went back to work. And I started thinking about the summer, and I realized I couldn't remember a single word from any of the lectures. I couldn't remember any of the abstruse doctrine or any of the really kind of very deep and profound teachings. But the person I couldn't get out of my head was Reverend Kusada. I just had never met anyone like him before. He was just so unique. And the only thing I could think of was I need to study with this person. And so I went back out to California, and I returned the next year for the next summer session and entered the MA program that fall. There was something about Reverend Kusada. There was a quietness and there was a humility that went beyond words. Reverend Marvin Harada, our bishop, shares these words. He says, I never knew what humility meant until I met Reverend Kusada. He was the most humble person I think I have ever known. But this humility also had a dynamic power to it. There's no question about that. A very powerful silence and humility. As I mentioned, Reverend Kusada was a Renaissance man. Throughout his career, he both studied and practiced and also demonstrated many of the arts, especially liturgical chanting, tea ceremony, calligraphy, Aikido, Gagaku, and magic. Reverend Dean Koyama, who is also a teacher of Aikido, he says this: Reverend Kusada was a man of many talents. He held a 3rd degree black belt in Aikido. Reverend Koyama says, I recall seeing a clip of Koichi Tohei and Kusada Sensei. Koichi Tohei was the dojocho, the head instructor of Hombu Dojo, and I saw a lot of influence of Tohei Sensei in Kusada Sensei's techniques and practices. Reverend Jerry Hirano, also thinking back to that retreat in Ogden, Utah, says this: at the retreat, the resident minister of the temple had told Reverend Kusada that Aikido wasn't a real martial art, even after Reverend Kusada had given a demonstration. This minister was at Reverend Kusada's Aikido demonstration. This minister had been a Japanese national karate champion before coming to BCA as a Kakehashi. And he was explaining to us, but really directing his comments to Reverend Kusada, that karate is a real martial art and Aikido is some new wannabe martial art. Reverend Jerry says, I can't remember who it was, but one of us asked Reverend Kusada, Sensei, how can you let someone just talk down about Aikido? First, Reverend Kusada gave a little smile and said, was something bad said? And we all said, yes, he said Aikido wasn't a real martial art. Reverend Kusada then explained, if you hear something that you do not agree with, you let it go in one ear and just let it go out the other. That is Aikido. Then he smiled and walked away. And Reverend Jerry says, I can still see and hear this conversation after nearly 50 years. It changed my life. Sensei was also a master in tea. He studied the Yabunouchi school of tea. Yabunouchi is a school affiliated or associated with the Honganji. And he often would serve tea in an outdoor ceremony called nodate. You can see it in the lower right-hand corner here, the nodate. This is up in Tilden Park during one of the summer sessions, I believe. He was also a master in calligraphy, and Reverend Koyama shares this memory. It says, many years ago, I helped coordinate a youth retreat in San Luis Obispo. We asked Reverend Kusada to conduct a Shodo calligraphy workshop for the kids. Many of the kids had never even written a Japanese character, let alone with a fude brush before, so we thought it would be easy for someone as proficient as Reverend Kusada to do a simple calligraphy workshop showing the very basics. The evening before the scheduled day of the calligraphy workshop, all of the coordinators were getting ready to sleep, as we had an 8 a.m. service to get ready for. However, Reverend Kusada pulled out a pad, a paper, a brush, his sumi ink, and began to practice his calligraphy. In perfect posture, he continued to practice for a good half hour or so. Sensei asked, "What are you doing?" "I must practice," was his reply. "Sensei, you don't need to practice. Most of these kids have never written a Japanese character before. They wouldn't know the difference." "All the more reason to practice," was his reply. This is the kind of person Sensei was. Reverend Shinseki tells an interesting story about how once he was giving a ride to Kusada Sensei in his car, and Kusada Sensei was real excited. He had a new tape, and he said, "Can I play my new tape? Can I play my new tape?" And I think Reverend Shinseki thought it was some kind of music, so he's probably interested in what kind of music Reverend Kusada was going to listen to. So he popped the tape into the tape player, and it was an English language tape. Even though Sensei's English was quite good, he always practiced. For him to practice was something you did regularly, ordinarily, usually. This is what practice meant, is to live your life each and every day. Sensei was a chanting master. He taught chanting at IBS since he became the director, and later on, even when he was a minister at the Berkeley Buddhist Temple, he taught generations of students. And I think he ended up with the last of the students were probably Reverend Gibbs, Reverend Bridge, Reverend Briones, and others into later generations. I still remember his chanting classes very vividly. I recall, for instance, in the very beginning, we'd all sit around the room and Reverend Kusada would be facing us, and he'd take out the chanting book, and he would then he would show how particular something would be chanted. So he chanted by himself, very beautifully, of course, and then he'd invite all of us to join in. We chanted together once or twice, and when he was satisfied, he would start going around the room, having each person chant individually. This put me in a blind panic. I was just shaking and sweating when this occurred. And so they started chanting. Of course, Dean Koyama was a really good chanter. Derry Hirano was a really good chanter. Came to me, he said, "Okay, please begin." And I said, Sensei, I can't chant. I can't chant. I don't know how to do these things. I don't know how to chant." He goes, "Oh, okay. Okay, please begin." I said, No, Sensei, you don't understand. I didn't grow up as a Buddhist. I never chanted when I was young. I can't chant. He said, "Oh, okay. Okay, please begin." I said, "No, Sensei, you don't understand. My voice is too low. I can't chant that high. I can't read Japanese." He goes, "Okay, please begin." So there's no getting away from it. I had no choice but to begin chanting. Of course, it was terrible. He never criticized us. That's the other thing. He never said, "Oh, you're terrible." But to me, unfortunately, he probably came as close as he ever did. You can see that Sensei didn't have any hair. So when I would chant, occasionally I would see him put his head in his face in his hands. So all you could see is the top of his head, and it would be turning all red, and he'd give off this sound as I was chanting, and I knew that's really bad. Anyway, we had great days, even as terrifying as they might have been when Sensei was teaching us at IBS. He was made to resign from IBS in 1981. And I want to tell you a story that I don't think anyone has ever heard. Reverend Jerry knows it, but I'm going to tell it if that's okay. We were really mad because we believe he was made to resign. And so Jerry and I, of course, we were children of the 60s and 70s. We did what we would normally do. We started protesting and yelling and screaming. We demanded a meeting with the bishop, the president of the BCA, the IBS board of trustees. We got them all in a room. We said, "We demand that you keep Kusada Sensei at IBS." But apparently decisions had already been made, and it was decided that he would not be at IBS. And so we were upset. We were prepared to leave IBS. Personally, I was ready to leave IBS and BCA, just go home and be a lawyer again. We were so mad. And I remember sharing that with Reverend Kusada, and his words, I can still hear in my brain. He said, you do what you have to do, but remember, never act out of anger. And he was the one who was being affected by all this, but he was the one saying, don't act out of anger. And that just calmed me down. And both Jerry and I decided we would graduate from IBS and go to Japan to study for the ministry. Luckily, however, he was assigned to the Berkeley Buddhist Temple to the delight of all the members there. And it was wonderful. Jerry and I became Dharma school teachers under the tutelage of Judy Kono and Emiko Katsumoto. And I used to attend his morning service every day at 6:30 to chant Shoshinge. Then after chanting together, we go up to the minister's residence and we'd have tea and just talk. And I love those moments, though I cherish those moments when he and I could just talk. And there was a time that he agreed to give an Aikido demonstration to the Dharma school kids. He needed a dummy to throw around, and so I was that dummy. We cleared all the furniture out from the living room of the residence. He would just toss me around the living room. And it was the most fun I ever had. I can't believe it. It was great. When Sensei was about to leave IBS, we students decided to give him a farewell party. And so we hatched a plan. We told him that we were going to take him out to dinner. I think there are only a few of us who said that. I think it was Jerry and Patty Baba, now Patty Yamashita, and Irene and Bante. And so we said, okay, we're going to take you out to dinner. Let's meet at IBS. But we didn't tell him that we invited all of his former students, and many of them came on their own dime. They came from all over the place, and they gathered at IBS. And at the old IBS upstairs, there was a second floor hondo where we always had services. So all of the students gathered there. They hid their shoes. They were sitting in the hondo. We had Sensei back to IBS. We said, oh, Sensei, since you're here, let's have a service just for old time's sake. So he put on his fuho and wagesa and he walked in, expecting it just to be a handful of us. And the place was completely packed with his students and former students. And Sensei, being Kusada Sensei, was really shy and didn't want to even walk in the room. We finally convinced him to go in and to lead us in chanting. And when he did, it's something I'll never forget. He started the chanting of Shishin Rai. And when we all joined in, we chanted with one voice because we were all students of Kusada Sensei. We chanted in the exact same way. It's something I'll never forget. I'll just kind of cut some of these stories short a little bit. Just when, after Sensei retired from BBT, he went to Japan to study at the Honganji, study chanting, and we had the opportunity to throw him a 77th birthday party at Chogenji, a temple of our good friends, Reverend Dennis and Yoko Yoshikawa. And that's Sensei at his birthday party. And he, there were a lot of us there, and we enjoyed ourselves. And he just took it upon himself to start speaking. And he didn't speak English anymore at that point, so he's speaking just Japanese. I had to translate it. And I'll never forget that talk. It was so heartfelt, so sincere. And one of the things he said is that, serving in IBS was my purpose in life. And I think all of us, we're speechless when we thought about that. You know, Sensei, he felt that his life was devoted to the education and training of people in Buddhism and the supporting of people who wish to become ministers. Many of us were lucky to have learned from Kusada Sensei, to have known him, and we all remember him with the deepest gratitude and respect, and an aspiration to savor the Nembutsu that was alive within his heart. Just three more short stories about Reverend Kusada. One is from Reverend Harry Bridge. He says, one of my fondest memories of Kusada Sensei was when he explained the significance of itadakimasu. He said it was gratitude to the entire universe, and explained how the earth, rain, and sun were all in the meal we were about to partake of. Reverend Gregor Gibbs says, there was a time when an IBS student asked another honored professor whether it was proper to say the Nembutsu if you don't think you have ever experienced Shinjin. The professor responded, "Do kana, I wonder." And the student then asked Reverend Kusada the same question, to which the Reverend Kusada said, "You don't have to worry about that. There's something about the Nembutsu that will take care of that problem for you." Reverend Gibbs says, I like Kusada Sensei's answer very much better than the other response. And finally, just here's a story from Bhante Silawimala. You saw a picture of Bhante earlier. Bhante and Reverend Kusada lived together at IBS for a very long time. They were good buddies, and they were like, I think Bhante probably knew Reverend Kusada better than anyone else. And Bhante gives this short anecdote, if I could read it to you. He said, the current IBS dorm is where IBS used to be located. And so after school was over, everyone would leave, but Kusada Sensei lived downstairs in the apartment. And Bhante, he said, I lived upstairs. Anyway, one morning I woke up and I came downstairs. I was shocked to see that all the desks in the classroom had been moved to the side and 2 large Persian rugs had been taken away. The first thing that came to mind was that we had been robbed, because it must have happened after midnight, and no one connected with IBS would have come here after midnight to borrow the rugs. I checked the front door and it was closed. So with a shaken mind, I knocked on Kusada Sensei's door, which was next to the classroom. He came out and I asked him if he had let someone borrow the rugs for some event. He said no. He looked at the classroom where all the desks were scattered and the 2 valuable rugs were gone. And I said to him, Sensei, we must have been robbed. I expected him to be shocked and upset to see what had happened there. He just scratched his head and smiled with great amusement and said, oh my, how did they do that? His approach to such a shocking event, Bhante says, was very interesting to me, and I started laughing with him, or maybe at him. To me, this was a real Kusada Sensei-like expression. It was a reaction of an evolved person at seeing a great loss or tragedy. I always thought that he was perhaps worthy of being called a myokoni, a wonderfully excellent person of Shinjin, according to the Jodo Shinshu tradition. So that's my reflections on Reverend Kusada. Hopefully there'll be time at the end, and some of you who knew Sensei, maybe you want to share some of your own stories. I next want to talk about Reverend Jitsuen Kakehashi, who was born October 3rd, 1927, passed away May 7th, 2014. The way I describe Kakehashi Sensei is this way. He was a Dharma master. He was a kind and beloved spiritual leader. And he was also a true person of the Nembutsu. I first met Kakehashi Sensei. Let me see, I'll actually give his life, sorry about that. So Kakehashi Sensei, Jitsuen Kakehashi, was born on October 3rd, 1927 in Himeji City in Hyogo Prefecture. He studied at Shugakuin within the Honganji, kind of an advanced specialty school. And he was a renowned scholar, minister, and author. He served as one of the principal teachers at the Gyoshin Kyoko Institute, a school for the advanced study of Jodo Shinshu in Takatsuki City. Kakehashi Wajo was appointed as Kangaku by the Honganji and also served as the director of the Jodo Shinshu Kyogaku Kenkyujo. He later became the president emeritus of Gyoshin Kyoko. Kakehashi Sensei was a resident priest of Kodaiji, a Jodo Shinshu temple in the Abeno ward of Osaka. He was a noted speaker, author of many books. He was a beloved spiritual leader and admired by Shin Buddhist followers throughout the world. Reverend Kakehashi passed away at the age of 86 on May 7th, 2014 in Osaka. Kakehashi Sensei was a prolific writer. Here's just a partial list of some of his published works. I won't go into all these. I just want to show you the voluminous number of texts that he authored. This is some of them. Here's some more. And that's only a partial list. And he was such a brilliant writer. Let me tell you a little bit about how I met him. I met Reverend Kakehashi in the spring of 1985, sorry, shortly after Jerry Hirano and I arrived in Kyoto. Reverend Kyoshin Yamashita introduced me to Kakehashi Sensei, who at the time was the director of the Dendo-bu, the propagation bureau of the Honganji. He immediately struck me as a very kind gentleman who seemed interested in my study plans at Yukoku. He asked me all about it. I remember he invited me to audit at Gyoshin Kyoko, that school where he was the teacher and the president, after my studies at Yukoku were completed. I next encountered the scholastic brilliance of Kakehashi Sensei when I began auditing the Ango sessions at the Honganji. Ango sessions are held once a year at Yukoku at the, um, the central building in the Omiya campus. It always takes place at the hottest time of the year. It's an ancient, it's based on the ancient Buddhist sort of tradition when monks gather during the rainy season for study. So it's a very intense study session in which people study the Anjin Rondai, the topics on the essential features of Jodo Shinchu teachings, of Shinjin practice and assurance of birth. Kakehashi Sensei, when I heard him there, he gave a brilliant talk. And he also served as sort of the referee, the scholar who would resolve all these doctrinal debates going on at the time. After I heard what he had to say and just really was impressed by his brilliance, I began to go to every Dharma talk that I could find that he gave and every lecture, and I bought as many of his books and I just devoured them. He's just a wonderful, wonderful teacher. And after I completed my MA degree at Ryukoku, I asked Sensei if I could audit for a year at Gyoshin Kyoko, and he kindly allowed me to do that. Gyoshin Kyoko is a school for the advanced study of Jodo Shinchu, as I mentioned. It's in Takatsuki City. From Kyoto, it's on the way to Osaka, so I would take a train there. This school was founded by Kagai Senmyo of the Kuge scholastic lineage. So it was a wonderful school. You can see sort of a sense of how it is. People wear their robes and they're studying very intently. So I would take the train to Takatsuki City, probably about a 35, 40-minute ride. I would walk another kilometer through the neighborhoods to reach Gyoshin Kyoko. It was a wonderful atmosphere. I remember once I had an opportunity to meet with Kakehashi Sensei after his lecture, and there was a question of consciousness and all this kind of thing. So I asked Sensei, what is the meaning of kokoro? Kokoro is a word you see often translated as heart and mind. I said, Sensei, what is the meaning of kokoro for you? And he thought about it a bit. He said, for me, kokoro is sekai. It's the world. This heart of mine is the world, okay? I didn't know what he meant at the time, and I was thinking about it, and I keep thinking about it, but little by little, I'm beginning to gain some sense of what Kakehashi Sensei was saying when he says, the real meaning of kokoro is the world. Just another kind of incident that took place at Gyoshin Kyoko. One of the customs is all students take turns giving Dharma talks at the morning service. And so even though I was auditing, I was assigned to give a Dharma talk. And so I worked really hard on it. I worked on it for a long time, stayed up late the night before to finish it. And as would of course be the case, I overslept. And so I missed my train, which was horrible. I was standing on the train platform, just panicking, caught the next train, got to Takatsuki and started running down the streets, that 1 kilometer to the school. And this is the middle of July, of course, so I'm just sweating profusely. I come to the entrance there, you could see, and I start putting on my fuho, I guess, but the service had already started and they were ending the chanting. And so I raced into the hondo with my fuho barely tied and kind of slid along the wooden floor into my place, just as the chair turned to me to give my Dharma talk. And so I gave my Dharma talk. I don't remember a thing of what I said. It was just completely blank, but I do remember afterward, Kakehashi Sensei said, the whole thing was quite exciting. Anyway, so he was a good person. He had a lot of concern and compassion for someone like me. He also had a great sense of humor. Later on at IBS, we invited Kakehashi Sensei to be a special Numata lecturer in 1997. This was the time Honganji was gearing up for the 500th year commemoration of Rennyo Shonin. And so we asked Kakehashi Sensei to give talks about Rennyo's life and teachings, which he did at IBS. He gave brilliant lectures at IBS. And at the time, Professor Eisho Nasu, who was at IBS, and I then accompanied Sensei to Los Angeles, where he gave public lectures at Gardena Buddhist Temple and Orange County Buddhist Church. And at that time, I was honored to begin the translation of his book, Hikari o Kakagete, which was translated as Bearer of the Light, the life and teachings of Rennyo. 2 years later, BCA invited Kakehashi Sensei to be one of the keynote speakers at the BCA Centennial Service in commemoration in August of 1999. And again, I was honored to translate Sensei's talk as the path transcending birth and death, a Shin Buddhist perspective on life and death. In addition, we had all these plans hatched for Kakehashi Sensei while he was here. He agreed to give a workshop to Bisei ministers, which he entitled The Contemporary Significance of Anjin Rondai. Just a brilliant lecture. And finally, Professor Natsu and I cooked up a great plan. We brought Sensei up to Napa because he loved wine. So we spent a day of wine tasting and conversation. And the three of us sat down under a shady spot in a vineyard. And we turned on the tape recorder and we just talked. And we talked about all sorts of things for hours. We talked about Shin Buddhist ethics, the interface of religion and science, the importance of Shinchu in a religiously plural world. All of these things are going on. And I still have those cassettes. One of these days, after I retire, stop doing all this stuff I'm doing at IBS, I'm going to transcribe and translate those tapes. Anyway, the last time I met Kakehashi Sensei was at Kodaiji, his temple in Osaka, in 2005. At the time, he was still really Genki. He was giving public lectures, Dharma talks, and writing extensively. And he allowed me to, he gave me permission to share some of his writings as well with the English-speaking world. So these are two of the works that are of Reverend Kakehashi in English, the Bearer of the Light, and also a translation done by Toshikazu Arai, Hearing the Buddha's Call. I'd just like to end this part by reading a couple of passages from Kakehashi Sensei's writings. The first is from Bearer of the Light. This is actually a lecture he gave at Gardena Buddhist Temple, in which he talked about Renyo's letter on Kengyoku, his second daughter, who really made a tremendous impact on Renyo. I won't go into detail about that just because of time, but if you're interested in reading about Kengyoku, please get the book, or we also have a translation of the letter on Kengyoku in our Pacific World, the IBS Journal. It's available for free online. You can go to it. I think it's the third series, volume 1. So Reverend Kakehashi ends his lecture on Kengyoku in this way. I'm skipping a lot, but it kind of ties up a lot of points. He says, here we can see a father and daughter, even as they are separated by death. Kengyoku died before Renyo, actually walking together on the same path to the Pure Land. Those who are born before should lead those who come after them, while those who are born later should follow those who have gone on before. On this path, they are guiding each other. Each is the other's teacher. Each is a student of the other. This sense of being fellow good teachers on the path to the Pure Land is the true meaning of the phrase fellow practicers, dogyo. It is also the true meaning of parent and child, for in its most fundamental sense, that relationship is not just of this world. Renyo and his daughter Kengyoku teach us that the Nembutsu is the true expression of the eternal bond between parent and child. These words of his are very memorable to me. I can still hear Sensei saying them in Gardena, and they mean a lot to me. And I think they probably mean a lot to people out there as well. And finally, I'd just like to read this excerpt from his keynote address at the BCA Centennial. He says this: when we are called to awaken by the Buddha, the parent of our true life, the horizon of our heart and mind opens up to reveal the world that transcends birth and death. Protected by the Tathagata in this way, we continue on our life's journey toward the Pure Land. When we finally approach the moment of death, our life does not simply perish in vain. Instead, death becomes a wondrous opportunity in which the realm of unlimited life opens up before us. This understanding represents the Nembutsu followers' perspective on life and death. When I hear this, again, it resonates very deeply in my heart. And I think about all my other good teachers of the way who have gone on before me. But it also, I'm starting to get an inkling of what he meant when he told me, when he said that the meaning of kokoro is the world. I think this interconnectedness of ourselves and all other beings in the world, of the Buddha in ourselves, is very much essential, the key to the teaching of Jodo Shinshu. So that's Reverend Kakehashi. Now I'd like to move on to Reverend Takamaru Shigaragi. Shigaragi Sensei was born on September 15th, 1926. He passed away on September 26th, 2014. I describe him in this way: fearless, groundbreaking scholar, thoughtful mentor, and also a person of the Nembutsu. Let me tell you a little bit about Shigaragi Sensei's life. Takamaru Shigaragi was born in 1926, the second son in the family of Reverend Shiu Shigaragi, the resident priest of Kyoenji, a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist temple in Hiroshima province, prefecture, sorry. In 1942, he received the Tokudo ordination in the Shin Buddhist Honganji branch and went on to study Buddhism at Ryukoku University in Kyoto. After completing his undergraduate and graduate studies at the university in 1955, he went on to study at the Shugakuin Academy of the Honganji, and he later became an instructor at Ryukoku in 1958. He was appointed to the position of professor of Shin Buddhist studies in 1970 and became the resident priest of Kyoenji in 1975. Dr. Shigaragi's long scholastic career culminated with his being awarded the degree of Doctor of Literature, Bungaku Hakase, from Ryukoku University. He also served as president of Ryukoku University from 1989 to 1995. Upon retirement, he was conferred with the status of Professor Emeritus of Shin Buddhist Studies at Ryukoku University. He also served as the chair of the Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai, the Buddhist Promoting Foundation in Tokyo, Japan, from 1995 to 2008. Sensei passed away at the age of 88 at his temple on September 26, 2014. He wrote extensively as well. These are just a sample of some of his scholarly works. I won't go over them in detail, but there's some wonderful works. One of them, I don't know if Ken Yokogawa is here, but one of his Shinran Nyokeru Shin no Kenkyu, I promise you, Ken, I will get this translation done in this life or the next. Okay, I promised Ken that for years, but this is one of the my great responsibilities in life. Here's some more works by Shigaragi Sensei, and you can see at the bottom a couple in English. The Buddhist World of Awakening, published by the Buddhist Studies Center in Honolulu, translated by Reverend Masuda, William Masuda, and the Heart of Shin Buddhism, the Life of Awakening, published by Wisdom Publications. So let me tell you a little bit about Shigaragi Sensei, if I could. There's a lot to tell, but I'll try to keep my thoughts within a period of time so we can all respond. We can all maybe share some thoughts as well. I first met Shigaragi Sensei in 1984 when I first started studying at Ryukoku University. I was in the Japanese language program, and I was allowed to audit a couple Shinshu courses. So Reverend Marvin Harada, then simply Marvin, introduced me to Sensei because Sensei had been on a sabbatical leave, which I'll talk about in a little while, and he spent a year at IBS from 77 to 78, exactly the time when Reverend Harada was studying there. And so they got a chance to know each other, and then Marvin entered the Shigaragi Zemi, which I'll talk about a little bit, what the Zemi is. Anyway, he urged me to start sitting in the weekly session of what's called the Shinshu Gakugairon, so the outline of Shin Buddhist studies, which Shigaragi Sensei taught every year. And so I went to that class, and I sat in there with Marvin and other students. Reverend Harada says this: I took Sensei's outline of Shin Buddhist studies for the 3 years I attended Ryukoku. His lectures were part lecture and part Dharma talk, and were always powerful and moving. I admired his courage and spirit to make Shin Buddhism relevant for people today and not be bound or limited by tradition. I agree with every single word that Reverend Harada has said. So try to get this imagery. We're what's called ryugakusei. We're international students. And generally what we would do is we sit in the first row of the class. Most of the Japanese students were at the back of the class. Some of them were awake, some of them were not awake. But anyway, we international students, we were in the first row, sitting up there, all with our tape recorders in hand. And we put our tape recorders on the desk and we'd be sitting there. Of course, I was emulating my fellow international students. I couldn't understand a word that was going on, not one word of what Sensei was saying. But I would go back every night to my dorm room, and I would start listening to the tape over and over again. what I would do initially is I would write down every sound I heard. I didn't know if it was a word. I didn't know if he was clearing his throat. I didn't know if it was a grunt, whatever. I would write down every sound. Then I'd go back over it, listen to the tape again, try to figure out what was a word, what wasn't a word. I'd go to a dictionary, try to figure out what these words meant, try to put them together in sentences and into some sort of coherent thought. I would do that for every single lecture, but mainly for Shigaragi Sensei's lectures, because as Reverend Marvin said, they were powerful. They weren't just lectures, they were Dharma talks. And sometimes he would get very emotional when he talked. And so I wanted to know what he was talking about. So this process would go on, not just that first year, but it would go on for years as well. I attended his lecture 4 years in a row, as did many of Sensei's students. So in the beginning, probably for a 90-minute lecture, I would probably listen to that lecture for 5 or 6 hours time and take notes and finally start to understand what Shigaragi Sensei was saying. But the real outcome of that is I would begin as I would go to sleep, hearing his voice in my head. And even to this day, when I read writings by Shigaragi Sensei, I can hear his voice speaking in my head. And the next year at Ryukoku, I entered the MA program. And again, thanks to Reverend Marvin, I entered the Shigaragi Zemi. Now, a Zemi is sort of different from what we have in America. The Zemi or Seminaru is sort of a European university setup. It's kind of like a homeroom where you're affiliated with a given professor and that professor helps to guide you. And usually students will get together in sort of like a seminar and give papers or guide each other. But the Shigaragi Zemi was the place to be. Instead of just a handful of actual students, there might have been 30 to 40 people in the room at any given time, not just master's students, not just doctoral students, but people who had already graduated, people who were ministers, people who just wanted to learn from Shigaragi Sensei. So probably 30 to 40 people at any given time. And we took up really interesting issues, cutting edge topics like Shin Buddhism and world peace, social ethics, discrimination, politics and religion, environmental ethics. All of these are topics that were being discussed in the Shigaragi Zemi. Again, not just current students, not just graduates, but people from all over the community. And it was the place to be. And this where also that I met some of my really dear friends, Ryukoku, Professor Dake, Mitsuya Dake, Professor Nabishima, and also a person by the name of Shaku Tesshu Sensei, who is now well known in Japan as a popular writer of Buddhism. It was a great place to be. But as I mentioned, every single year I was at Ryukoku, I sat in that introductory class, sitting in the front row with a tape recorder and just really enticed by Shigaragi Sensei's speaking. Really just this really dramatic, very powerful speaking, charismatic sort of presence he had. I took all of his other classes and enjoyed learning from him. One thing that Sensei also did is he would make a point of getting together with the international students, the Ryugakusei, from time to time, and we'd have our own private study class with him. So Reverend Harada, later Reverend Dean Koyama, Reverend Eric Matsumoto, we were all in the Zemi, along with Professor Hoyo Ishida, who used to be a minister in the BCA. We'd have a small group study intensive sessions with Shigaragi Sensei. They are fantastic, just unbelievably, just wonderful, evocative from many different standpoints. Sensei continued to write and speak throughout Japan. He gave series of lectures at the Rokkaku Kaikan, Mount Hiei, Hiroshima, Osaka, and elsewhere throughout Japan. And his teachings, I think, really went to the heart of Shinran's teaching. His understanding wasn't simply academic or objective, but deeply religious, deeply spiritual in nature. He was also extremely critical of the Nishi Honganji orthodoxy and orthopraxy. He was critical of overly conceptualized and abstract, overly literal interpretations of Shinran's thought. He felt that the orthodox perspectives were grounded in an insular thinking, anchored in the Edo period schools of thought. And he was also very critical of religious institutions for its willingness to deviate from the heart of the Shin Buddhist path and to overlook the living core of Shinjin. the ultimate religious experience of transformative awakening. And as a result, he was also criticized. He was often accused of being a heretic or being Ianjin. He shared a story with me once that he said he took a sabbatical leave in 77, 78. He spent a year at IBS, where he got a chance to know Reverend Kusada very well, and Marvin and Reverend Carol and others at the time, Reverend Fuji. But as his time of the sabbatical was coming to an end, he said he got a letter from a friend in Japan telling him not to go back to Kyoto. He said because they're laying, there are plans now to bring you in front of the Honganji Adjudicative Board and to accuse you of being a heretic. So he got this warning not to come back, but of course he went back. And he was called before the board to defend his views. But this is really indicative of who Shigaragi Sensei was and of his character. He said, instead of cowering before them, he turned it around and he told the panelists that they needed to defend themselves for distorting Shinran's teaching. So after that, no one bothered him. He was like this 800-pound gorilla in a room, and no one wanted to provoke him. So this is Shigaragi Sensei. This is a real clear notion. Like I said, he was fearless in his scholasticism, but also in his religious mind. He visited IBS on a number of occasions. Of course, his sabbatical leave in 77, 78. We also invited him in September of 1999 to give lectures on Shin Buddhism. And those lectures became a Japanese text called Shinshu no Tai, and became translated as the heart of the Shin Buddhist path, the life of awakening. We also invited him in February 2005 to give the keynote address at our symposium that we had in conjunction with the BCA. This was the first time the BCA had asked IBS to hold a symposium in conjunction with the National Council meeting in February. I think some of you could tell me who it was. I think it was Doug Iwamoto was the president at the time, and he made that suggestion. So we held a symposium, and we decided to have the symposium on the topic of meditation in American Shin Buddhism. And so Shigaragi Sensei came and he gave the keynote address at that time. And then again in February 2013, we invited him to speak both at IBS and at the Winter Pacific Seminar on the topic of the path of Nembutsu, and also an IBS symposium entitled Tradition and Insight in San Mateo. So I think we have a couple of photos. These are the books in English by Shigaragi Sensei: The Buddhist World of Awakening and The Heart of the Shin Buddhist Path. These are some photos from the symposia the lower part. These are all the speakers at the symposium on meditation in American Shin Buddhism. And this is Sensei giving a workshop at the time. He also spoke at the Berkeley Buddhist Temple. You can see on the left. He visited the Jodo Shinshu Center. He gave a number of other talks at the time as well. You know, at the time in 2013, Shigaragi Sensei's wife had passed away. And so he was accompanied by his daughter, Noriko, as well as I think one of his grandkids. And Dake Sensei came to accompany Sensei as well. And this time he brought his son, Nobuya, with him. I don't know if Nobuya is with us today, but if so, welcome. Sensei spoke at IBS and at various places around BCA. And so he and Nobuya had many opportunities to just converse one-on-one about Shin Buddhism. And I think there was just a really life-changing sort of set of events for Nobuya as well. I want to tell you a little bit about what happened. This is kind of a personal anecdote, but this is something very close to me. This tells you a little bit about Shigaragi Sensei. As his visit was coming to a close, we had a dinner for him in San Mateo after the symposium. And Reverend Marvin was there, Dake Sensei, and it's my wife, Diane. On the bottom left-hand side, that's Noriko-san and Nobuya. And our son, David, was also there. And so we had a good time. We were enjoying ourselves. And sometime during the evening, I noticed that somehow Shigaragi Sensei and my son, David, were having a moment together. I was thinking, what's going on there? Because I said, David doesn't speak Japanese, and I know Sensei doesn't speak English, and he doesn't know signs. So how are they communicating? But they were having a moment together, and it's kind of fascinated with me. It fascinated me. The next day, Sensei left, and we promised that we'd see each other again. But the amazing thing is, after that evening that my son David, our son David spent with Shigaragi Sensei, from that day on, he started spontaneously vocalizing Namu Amida Butsu. You know, he had never done that before. His dad was a minister, and of course, I was trying like crazy to get him to say the Nembutsu. So I was like, no, we'd put our hands together and say Namu Amida Butsu. He didn't have any time for me, not interested at all. But somehow, in that moment he shared with Shigaragi Sensei, he was inspired to say the Nembutsu. And he still says it today, every day, sometimes very spontaneously. He and I have a morning service together. He rings the bell. We say the Nembutsu together. And that has brought about a deeper level and dimension of connection and settlement for me, and all thanks to Shigaragi Sensei. And I really think that both Nobuya and David, our sons, became some of Shigaragi Sensei's final students. And I'm very, very gratified to know that. So these are wonderful, wonderful teachers. Let me just share a couple other thoughts if I could. Words that Shigaragi Sensei left with us, okay? So this is from his book, The Heart of the Shin Buddhist Path. He says this: when we deeply look into a thing, the eye that sees becomes in and of itself the thing that is seen. As we see a tulip, we enter into the life of that flower. Becoming one with the life of the tulip, we come to know the tulip and see the tulip. Conversely stated, the life of the tulip reaches into our lives and into the deepest part of our hearts and minds. There we ourselves come to know that tulip's heart, as well as its life and the meaning of its existence. This way of seeing is called awakening. This is what Sensei says is the dynamic nature of Shinjin, religious experience of awakening, of entering into the heart and the life of another, okay, and the heart and mind of another enters into ours. And then he says this is also from the same book. The experience of awakening, which we realize through the practice of the Nembutsu, inevitably brings us to cast off our old selves and nurture the growth of a new personal human subjectivity. Where this kind of personal subjectivity is established, we come to realize paths upon which we are able to overcome the many hardships and obstructions that exist in the current situations of our lives. In other words, as we awaken to the dynamic working of the compassionate wisdom in our lives, we come to discard our old skin of arrogance, calculation, doubt, and pride. And little by little, step by step, we find ourselves born to our new selves, able to move ahead on our own life paths without fear or obstruction. This is what I've learned from Shigaragi Sensei, another of my true teachers of the way. So these teachers of the way, I think, are really important. And I'm so grateful that I was able to meet them just as if by chance. But their personalities, their teachings just fit like a glove perfectly. They've taught me so many things, and they continue to teach me many things. They teach me that today it may indeed be hard to meet true teachers of the way, and yet paradoxically, we may also have many opportunities to encounter them if we listen with open minds and open hearts, as the heart of the Buddha of infinite life flows into ours, as it flows into the lives and hearts of other beings who manifest that Dharma in their awareness, authenticity, and appreciation. So in a world like ours, hearts and minds are as diverse as the many voices of the Dharma. Some are the voices of traditional teachers, such as priests or religious masters. It just so happens that I'm talking about three people who are ministers and scholars: Reverend Kusada, Reverend Shigaragi, Reverend Kakehashi. But a true teacher of the way doesn't have to be a minister, isn't necessarily a scholar. This is what they've taught me. Each one of them has taught me this in a variety of ways, that there may be other teachers that we encounter in our lives. There may be other voices of the Dharma that we are able to hear. So others may be the voices of our parents, our spouses, our children, our friends, They may be the voices of the homeless, the disabled, or the oppressed, or we may hear the Dharma in the voice of a flower. So what these three true teachers of the way have taught me is that if we listen to their voices very carefully and with great respect, we may become, they may become our own true teachers of the way, telling us in wonder and joy of what they have received and experienced. They will not claim us as their disciples, but the awareness, authenticity, and appreciation of their lives will teach us that the Nembutsu is true, real, and alive. So thank you very much. This concludes my talk. Could you all please join me in Gassho? Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.